Hello! Welcome back to Drunk Storytime with Quefish. I am Quefish, the drunk. I'm not drunk yet. I had a beer before I started. If you happen to watch my drunken ramblings about my real life, you know that I've had a glass of wine already. I am drinking Barefoot Bubbly Pride 2020 limited edition. It's not bad. I'm probably going to add some Chambord to it. As a matter of fact, I'll do that right now. Oh God, I can't. Oh, I did open it. Oh my God. I wish that this was like a solid, because I would just eat this. God, it smells so good. It tastes so good. I've used Chambord to make milkshakes and syrup. God, it's just so good. And it makes everything better. If I remember correctly, excuse me, this is bubbly. I'm gonna be burpy. Excuse me again. If I remember correctly, that's actually one of the ways that you're supposed to use Chambord, is to mix it with sparkling things, champagne mostly, but sparkling wine is gonna do just as well. Anyway, I'm done rambling. I'm gonna read some fanfic now. So this first one is called The Road Not Taken by FancyTrinkets, aka FancyTrinkets. This one is for teen and up. Why do I feel like, hang on. Oh, balls. Hang on. I may have to, oh, oops. Okay, it's not gonna be The Road Not Taken. Okay, apparently, because I had done a recording months ago, like in the old house months ago, of a story called The Angel Line, which was Aziraphale Fine's pornographic audiobook that just happened to be read by Crowley. Totally a coincidence, right? And it's a series of 4. And at the time, I did want to do all 4, in a row. It didn't end up happening. And so I have my list here of all of the stories that I want to do. And I put them on the top. And I saw this one and I'm like, oh gosh, 3,000 words. Okay, that's about 25 minutes. 25 minutes. And I was like, well, why don't I do a shorter one? So I went to the next one down, because my next little thing says that it's going to be 2 videos because it's multiple chapters. And then the next one was The Road Not Taken. And so I went to that, and it was part 4 of this series, and I didn't even realize it. So, you know, universe is working against me. I'm gonna start out with a long one, I guess. Okay, this one is explicit, so adult content. Okay, so what are our tags tonight? Explicit sexual content, sexual content. Is there a difference between sexual content and explicit sexual content when it comes to AO3 tags? I'm curious. Sexual tension, masturbation, porn with feelings, pre-relationship, pre-apocalypse, humor, sexual fantasy, sexual humor. I am all about the sexual humor. I love it. Voice kink. Don't we all have that? And Crowley makes bold assumptions. Okay, so this is in the Ineffable Autoerotica series. The Naked Truth by FancyTrinkets. Summary: the one in which Crowley records a second pornographic audiobook and tries to find out what Aziraphale is thinking. Ready? Crowley recorded the second audiobook for its therapeutic effects. He needed something to distract him from the unmitigated anxiety of thinking about the first one. He wasn't even sure if Aziraphale had listened to the first one. What if he had been buying audiobooks at random? Maybe he'd try selling them to people in hopes they'd leave his first editions alone. That sounded like something Aziraphale might do. No, sir, I'm sorry. That first edition Wild is not for sale. Can I interest you in some pornographic audiobooks instead? Oh my god. I'm sorry. That's funny. His racing thoughts were starting to get on his nerves. Crowley silenced them the best way he knew how, with an intricate project designed to achieve an incredibly specific purpose. In this case, his aim was to suss out exactly how much Aziraphale understood about his online store, his not-so-clever pseudonyms, and the lovelorn feelings he'd openly confessed while narrating the exploits of Roger and Zark. The first step in his grand plan was to find another book to record. He had specific requirements for both the plot and the characters, which made it difficult to find something suitable by searching online. He steadfastly refused to read more than he absolutely had to, so he needed to get the perfect book on the first try. Good luck. Crowley was good at a lot of things, and he knew it. But finding works of contemporary fiction was not among his talents. Any other week, he would have been proud of that fact, but as it stood, he was going to need help for this one. He couldn't exactly ask Aziraphale for assistance, which left him with only one option. He would have to solicit help from a human. Since it felt treasonous to visit a bookshop that wasn't Aziraphale's, Crowley opted for a library. That, it turned out, was a very good decision. I'm giggling because my boyfriend is a librarian, like a master's library science person. And so I'm just picturing Crowley walking up to my boyfriend going, "Excuse me." The library human listened to him carefully as he explained the parameters for his book search. They even asked clarifying questions to better understand what he meant by an unlikely romance with a good ending, and probably between two human men. That worked last time. And absolutely filthy pornographic, but with lots of feelings. After he answered each question to the best of his ability, the library human looked thoughtful. "Wait here a moment," they said. "I'm going to ask a colleague of mine for recommendations." Then the library human went away for a while. Library human. Crowley occupied himself by disappearing all the available pens and pencils in the building and rematerializing them inside the paper towel dispensers in the lavatories. When the library human returned, they were smiling. "I think I have just the book for you," they said. "How do you feel about murder mysteries?" "Intrigued by them," Crowley said. "And what about nudist colonies?" they asked. "In favor of," he said. "And do you object to police officers?" "I always strive to," he said, loudly and often. The library human laughed joyfully at what they presumed was a joke. Crowley grinned back at them. Libraries were actually excellent places, he decided. He was extremely pleased with himself for having chosen to visit one. "Well," the library human explained, "in this book, you see, a police detective is one of the main characters." Said Crowley. "Is he all right, though?" "He's a bit, well, how to put this?" The library human was clearly struggling for words. No need to be polite on my account. Library human smiled nervously and then whispered a word they weren't supposed to say to a patron. He's a bit of a bastard, or so my colleague says, but apparently he's also very kind, especially towards the end. Actually, I think that sounds perfect. Oh, good. In that case, I'll write down the title for you. Let me just find a pencil. They glanced at the desk. That's odd. I could have sworn we had several. Crowley sighed, suddenly exhausted by his own propensity for complicating things. You dumbass. Later that day, Crowley was sitting in a comfortable chair in a small cafe reading his library book. It was indeed a murder mystery set at a nudist colony, which lent itself to wordplay about exposing the culprit. He made a note of that for his embellishments and color commentary. The leading man, Alistair. Alistair? I don't know. It's spelled Alastair, but I want to say Alistair, even though I think it's Alistair. Anyway, the leading man, Alistair, was a diligent police detective tasked with solving the crime. He wasn't so much going undercover, as he was traipsing around completely uncovered, to blend in, of course, as a newly arrived nudist resident. Oh my God. Unfortunately for him, one of the lead suspects recognized him immediately. The tall, quiet man with elegant fingers had been a dear friend of Alistair's throughout their adolescent years and young adulthood. They drifted apart after a misunderstanding led to a bitter argument, and then James, the friend, had got himself into trouble with the law. But they were both much older now. James was living a peaceful, solitary, and unclad life as a landscape painter. James was also very well endowed, Alistair noted, in terms of both artistic talent and his genitalia. Crowley approved of the story a great deal so far. The plot grew more intriguing the further he read, and he became so engrossed in the novel that he stopped paying attention to the sights and sounds of the cafe around him. After he'd been sitting for several hours at the same table, a barista approached him to explain that he'd need to make another purchase if he planned to remain. He had just begun reading one of the book's more intimate scenes. I'm not really in the mood to be bothered, he said without looking up from the page. Elsewhere in the cafe, a large stack of dishes suddenly slipped from the countertop, hit the floor, and smashed into thousands of dangerously sharp little pieces. After that, the barista became exceedingly busy with cleanup tasks and could no longer spare the time to badger local demons who were quietly reading and not hurting anyone at all. It was dark outside by the time he finished the book and left the cafe. He had successfully avoided his own anxiety and any further interaction with cafe humans for the entire afternoon. He returned to his flat, where he continued to distract himself by setting up his audio equipment. The microphone and recording device were a matched set and a pleasure to look at. Matte black and smooth to the touch, they conformed to his preferred aesthetic. Things he imagined a clever and worldly demon should own. He had never once opened the instruction manual. Devices worked for him because he wanted them to and trusted they would. Tonight would be no different. He started at the beginning, of course, but the reading went swiftly. By the end of the first hour, he was already a third of the way through. He read at a normal pace, but he had decided back at the cafe that he was not going to record every word of the novel. To that end, he had marked up the library book with a ballpoint pen. Crossing out large sections of text. The descriptive details were vivid and poetic, but not needed for the resolution of the murder plot or the consummation of the romance. Forget the meaty excess. His narration would cut straight to the bone. An apropos turn of phrase for a book like this one. The dead body... No, not the dead buddy. The dead body. That was my mistake. More wine. The dead body of the hapless murder victim had been cut up and disarticulated. And of course, James and Alistair were about to have a lot of sex. They'd never done it before. That was the thrilling part. Perhaps they'd indulged with others, perhaps not. The book didn't say, and Crowley didn't care enough to speculate. It was simply enough that they'd longed for each other in their younger days, but neither James nor Alistair had ever made a move to close the distance. And now here they were, stark naked and constantly wanking. In secret, of course, so as to prevent the evidence of their arousal from rising to the other's attention. Oh my God. You know, that is something that I've often had thoughts about. Where I live, there's actually a, I don't want to say famous because it's not like it's well known anywhere but here. But there's a well-known nudist colony in the area where I live. And that's always something that, I mean, as a woman, I wouldn't have as much of that problem as a penis owner would, to be as PC as I possibly can. And that has always, I've always wondered about that, because I know that even in like clothed societies, that, you know, penises, they do rectify sometimes without direct contact. And it's always something that I wondered about in a nudist colony is how do you, if you have sexual attraction, and I'm not saying that, you know, oh, I'm attracted to women, and so women turn me on. I'm not saying that every single pair of tits that walks by is going to cause an erection, but in the broadest general sense, how in a nudist colony would you hide that? You know, because a guy can be all turned on, you know, like sitting in a restaurant or something and be like, oh, damn, and start having like fantasies about the waitress or the woman across the whatever, and have an erection, but completely hideable. You can't do that in a nudist colony. That erection, everyone's gonna see it. That's just one of those things that has floated in my head ever since a friend of mine 20 years ago told me that he he had just completed a job. He was an electrician in a nudist colony, and I was like, oh, and how did that go? Anyway, it's totally neither here nor there. Secretly, secrecy fueled an atmosphere of paranoia and inflamed Alistair's suspicions. His feelings for James didn't matter. Not if the man was brutal and cruel, a murderer at heart. It was all very dramatic. Look, here's the thing, Crowley said to the microphone when the tension was becoming too much for him. James didn't do it. Turns out it was that other fellow, Edgar, or whatever, the bloke with the tattooed phallus. Which, I mean, that's gotta hurt, don't you think? He paused a moment, considering it further, and then deciding, I think it would hurt. Then he cleared his throat, took a sip of water, and continued reading. It probably wasn't a good idea to have given away the ending. Okay, that didn't even occur to me. Because when you're reading a book and you start putting together the clues, especially in a murder, like a mystery, and it didn't even occur to me that he had already read the book and was making guesses, as opposed to having read the book and was just fully giving away the plot. Okay. It probably wasn't a great idea to have given away the ending, but the murder plot wasn't the fun part anyway. The fun part was all the carnal stuff this pair of angst-ridden, horny humans were about to get up to. The investigation dragged on. James and Alistair had been dancing around each other for weeks, trying desperately to abstain, when at last their resolve gave out, crumbling beneath the weight of their mutual longing. Here we are, Crowley said. We've come to the part you've been waiting for. He laughed. He couldn't help himself. There was something particularly freeing about sitting in a dark room and speaking softly into a microphone. My room's not dark, but I completely understand. It felt private and safe. Like a confessional. But without a creepy priest to hear his sins. He was about to say something he knew he'd probably regret. I think you should put your hand down your trousers for while I read what's next, Crowley said. I think you really want to. And hey, no shame in that. I mean, I definitely want to. If I weren't so busy narrating right now, that's exactly what I'd be doing. So, just think about it. I promise I won't tell anyone. He winked at the microphone. Yes, Crowley is that flavor of dumbass. So am I. I've done that. I've winked in a voicemail and then been so upset when it wasn't recognized. Okay. Though of course, he winked at the microphone. Though of course, his listener would never know it. And then he resumed the narration. Alistair leaned closer. He was supposed to be interrogating his suspect, but the way James looked at him, with eyes full of trust and yearning, he couldn't bear to speak words of accusation. Please, he said, and before he could whisper another syllable, James had surged forward to kiss him. That kiss was just the start. They were already naked, of course, and with lubricant acquired from a nearby bedside table, it wasn't long before James had him open, moaning in pleasure. At long last it was happening. Alistair could scarcely believe it, but it was real. Crowley paused in his reading to add, "Some blasphemy next, you've been warned." And without missing a beat, he picked up where he had left off. "My God, yes," the enraptured detective whispered, to which James replied, "Oh, holy fuck." And fuck they certainly did. After their initial encounter, they couldn't keep away from each other. They both tried to abstain, but failed delightfully. That's a great phrase. By the time the book was 3/4 done, they'd had sex in side rooms and several hallways, on tables, against walls, and once even outdoors in a field, after Alistair had interrupted James at his work. James works there? That scene, was one of Crowley's favorites. James took him on all fours. At least that's how they started. By the end, he had Alistair pressed to the earth beneath him. As he sheathed himself over and over, angling for release, he whispered hot and fierce into the ear of his dearest friend and lover, "I know you don't trust me, but I love you just the same as if you did. I love you now, and I always have." There was plenty of arousal and thrusting, licking and straining, breaching and filling and pounding, and all of those lustful things that Crowley absolutely wanted to experience firsthand with Aziraphale. But the best parts were the achingly tender confessions. "It's not that you're beautiful," Alistair said as he stroked the naked length of James's endowment, "though of course you are. My friend, you're dear to me as no one else has been. And you know me in ways that no one else ever could." Crowley absolutely wasn't crying. He was simply imbuing his lines with emotion in a demonically accurate way. "Sure thing, Crowley." He had defaced a library book for Satan's sake. I was wondering when it was going to come back to that. He was very much a paragon of evil. He was also emotionally exhausted by the time he finished reading and clicked the button to end the recording. He wanted to crawl into bed and sleep for a week, but he was determined to see his project through. With a snap of his fingers, he summoned a case and packaging. He kept it simple, a plain dark cover with gold lettering for the title and name of the author. He placed the cassette tapes inside because, of course, he didn't trust Aziraphale to understand CDs or digital audio files. The next step was to add a small but cleverly crafted miracle to each cassette. They weren't meant for human ears. If a mortal being attempted to listen, the cassette would erase all its files. He added some fine print to the lower edge of the inside cover. Audio quality always guaranteed. Contact excellence at h-ll.net for complaints and queries. If Aziraphale was planning to sell this thing to a human rather than set it aside for his own listening pleasure, Crowley was determined to know. The last thing, and he thought the cleverest by far, was to use the product listing as an opportunity to gather information. Rather than list it once, he created 2 identical pages for selling the audiobook. He created the first listing under Honest Seller 666. That's totally subtle, dude. The fake online store he'd operated for the past couple years. And with a miracle, he made sure that the product was invisible to search engines and impervious to linking. If Aziraphale bought this copy, it would only be by visiting the online store directly. Crowley created the second product page for the same audiobook using a new and different seller profile. In order to find this one, Aziraphale would have to search online for the name C.J. Anthony. Depending on which version Aziraphale ordered, Crowley was ready to make several bold assumptions. If he purchased directly from Honest Seller 666, that meant he was keeping tabs on the store. He had probably figured out the obvious pseudonym, so he knew it was Crowley's store, which meant he also knew that he was ordering smutty books directly from his longtime friend and nominal nemesis. That would be interesting. If instead he bought the copy from the internet search, then he uncovered the pseudonym C.J. Anthony. But Aziraphale wouldn't have any reason to suspect that Crowley was operating the store as well. He would probably assume that Crowley didn't know anything about his recent purchasing habits. He probably thought recording the audiobooks was just another bizarre facet of Crowley's work. Aziraphale would never suspect they were created solely and explicitly for his benefit. Wink, wink. In a different way, that would also be interesting. Of course, if he didn't buy either of them, then he probably had acquired the first one unwittingly and then sold it to a human customer. How terribly awkward for everyone. Or, even worse, and substantially more awkward, Aziraphale could have listened to the first one and then realized he'd made a dreadful mistake. He would have recoiled in shock and horror when he arrived at Crowley's desperate words of, "Yes, love, my angel." Aziraphale was fond of him. Aziraphale was fond of him, of course. That was a given. But his desires weren't the same, and Crowley had been misreading them all along. He'd been yearning for a love that wasn't there and never could be. Aziraphale was an angel, and he was a demon. There was simply no way it could work. All of a sudden, Crowley felt lonely and very tired. He conjured a drink and a blanket and curled up on his sofa to be miserable for a while, and then fell into a fitful, uncomfortable night's sleep. It never even occurred to him that Aziraphale would attempt to purchase both copies. But when he woke the next morning and checked his laptop, that was exactly what he'd discovered. "Oh, come on," he said, because the first thing he felt was incredibly thwarted in all of his cleverness and planning. But as he reviewed the purchases, placed within a minute of each other, he realized that his plan had worked out after all. Aziraphale definitely knew it was him. He was keeping tabs on the store and searching for works by C.J. Anthony. Crowley couldn't do otherwise but conclude that the angel was on to him. He understood that Crowley was recording these ridiculous books just for him, and it seemed as though he didn't mind. Crowley grinned as he deployed a miracle to duplicate their cassettes and their packaging. Aziraphale wanted 2 copies. 2 copies he would get. Ever since he'd listened to the story of Zark and Roger. Oh, sorry. Hang on. It's a different tone. Ever since he'd listened to the story of Zark and Roger, Aziraphale had spent part of every evening lying down in bed, undoing his trousers and masturbating to the thought of having sex with Crowley. He was a terrible angel, and he knew it, because the only thing he regretted about it was not having the sound of Crowley's voice to accompany his climax. He had tried taking out the audiobook and listening to it all over again, but it wasn't quite the same. What he really wanted right now was to find a different one, where the story would be a surprise and the things Crowley said would be new and unexpected. He sat down at the computer and looked at it, then fiddled with the mouse for several seconds. He spent some time rearranging the desktop icons one by one. Then he got up and grabbed a book he'd been meaning to reread, but it was no good. A few minutes later, he was back at the computer, full of nerves but determined. He'd learned his lesson after the first time searching for audiobooks online. He was done with exploring the internet in the human fashion. Instead, he decided to try out a miracle. He asked the computer to reveal all available audiobooks read by C.J. Anthony. And to his great delight, the miracle worked. Sadly, there was only one more book, something called The Naked Truth, which sounded delightfully titillating. 2 copies were available. In retrospect, Aziraphale wasn't sure why he purchased them both. Perhaps it was simply that the sound of Crowley's voice was precious to him. He wanted all of it. He still wasn't certain what had driven Crowley to start creating audiobooks. He must have done it years ago, judging by the cassette tape format. From what Aziraphale understood, the cassette had reached its heyday in the early 1990s, before its usage had dropped off precipitously. Crowley was always so cutting edge in terms of technology. Oh God, that's fantastic. The one thing he could count on with near absolute certainty was that Crowley would not be paying attention to the whereabouts of these strange old recordings. Aziraphale's purchases would remain his own naughty little secret. So, not so much. That's fun. So that was part 2 of the Ineffable Audio Erotica series, The Naked Truth by FancyTrinkets. I am unbelievably sorry that it's taken this long to do part 2. Let's see, what's part 3? Part 3 is going to be a little over an hour of a video, so I am going to read that one next. I'm sorry, I feel like there's been a cat in the area. Like maybe I crossed by a cat recently, or maybe like the last person to touch this bottle had a cat. I have like a really, I don't want to say severe because it's not like I'm gonna die, but I have a really acute cat allergy, or rather pet dander allergy, because it doesn't matter if it's a cat or a dog or any other kind of animal, it's a dander thing. And it like just came out of nowhere. So now I look like I have COVID because it got like some pink eye going on. I swear it's not. Anyway, so that was part 2 of the Ineffable Audio Erotica series. So, I'm going to go to the next chapter, or the next part, for the next video. So, thank you very much. How am I flubbing my language that bad already? Thank you very much for joining me, and I will see you next time.